Hi, everyone, and welcome to the lineup. Today is September the 16th, 2021. I'm Barry Stagner, and before we jump in, would appreciate and covet all of your prayers as we had just a powerful and wonderful weekend last weekend at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills with Pastor Jack Hibbs at the Behold He Comes conference. And then this weekend, myself, Amir, Pastor Jack, and Dr. Bob Pearl will be speaking at actually Dr. Pearl's home church, Birchman Baptist Church in Fort Worth at the Awaiting His Return Prophecy Conference. So very excited about this, and much like what happened at Chino Hills, the conference booked up quickly, and therefore we've added a second day as well there. So Friday and Saturday we'll be at Birchman Baptist Church in Fort Worth, Texas at the Awaiting His Return Conference. So please keep us in prayer. And by the way, those who have been following along on Telegram, know that Amir had some nasty back problems this week, but thankfully he got that all straightened out and is much more comfortable and able to continue on with all that God has in front of him. So I have to say, this has been an interesting week. It's, as many weeks are, kind of all over the map emotionally. Very devastating circumstance here in California, at least for those who are hoping for a trend to a more conservative direction or a turn towards a more conservative direction in the state government. But the recall effort was not successful. Gavin Newsom is still the governor, and he has shown himself to be a bit vindictive. And I know it's an emotional thing for people to want to recall you from your office and all that. But there's definitely an agenda that is anti-God, anti-Bible, and even anti-sanity to some degree. So, hey, pray for us everywhere we go, especially here in the States. People ask, how can you live in California? Well, California is kind of like Iran or other countries. The people are wonderful. The people in charge, not so much. And so just please keep us in prayer moving forward. Now, we had another rather interesting development this week that I want to start our time with. And it goes back to the Abraham Accords. And our first article actually comes from the Times of Israel. And the headline reads, "We've only just begun. Abraham Accords partners mark 1 year since signing." The article says the UN ambassadors of Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco marked the 1 year anniversary of the signing of the Abraham Accords at a New York event on Monday, highlighting the swift development of ties between their countries. Please pay attention to that. The swift development aspect, because things are happening in a very rapid progression of late prophetically, and that is prophetic in and of itself. This event celebrating the ties and the normalization agreements that were inked a year ago, hosted by the Israeli mission to the UN at Manhattan Museum of Jewish Heritage. The event was attended by envoys from several other countries, including Oman's deputy ambassador to the UN, Ahmed Dawi Ali al-Jadal, whose country does not have official diplomatic relations with Jerusalem, and the Trump administration, which brokered the accord, sought a last-minute push for Oman and Jordan, or Israel rather, to normalize ties, but they resisted, wanting to see some progress in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process first. Now, here's why this story is so interesting, outside of the fact that just generally it has prophetic implications because of these specific nations normalizing ties with the nation of Israel, being identified in the Ezekiel 38 war scenario as those who will protest the invasion of the geographic region known as the Arab Gulf states. Absent from Monday's event, however, was any representative from Sudan, which signed an agreement to establish diplomatic ties last October, and the deal is yet to be finalized, though it has faced considerable opposition within Sudan. A diplomatic official told the Times of Israel Sudan's UN mission received an invitation but decided against attending the ceremony. Now, when this first started to materialize over a year ago, that the Sudan was on the radar, so to speak, for normalizing ties with Israel, I mentioned at that time, as did many others, that this is going to have to turn around because Sudan is one of the invading nations that sides with Iran and Turkey and Russia and the other states, the stand states, so to speak, as they have their invasion of Israel from the north, that God intervenes and destroys their invading armies. So we're seeing a bit of a reversal already, even if only on paper. The article is very telling and reminds you and I that what the Bible says is going to happen exactly as written. And it doesn't matter that there was some overtures made between the Sudan and Israel regarding normalizing ties. They are going to march into Israel with the other coalition forces, invade Israel, and Bahrain and the Saudis and the UAE are going to protest that invasion, and everything is falling into place. And again, swiftly falling into place. And that's what Revelation 1 actually tells us. The opening verse says, John was told that he was going to be shown things that would quickly come into place or happen quickly once they started. Actually, the word in the English translated there in Revelation 1:1 is shortly. And that word means in quick succession once they begin. So we are seeing things ramp up to a time period that thankfully you and I, as the body of Christ, are not going to be a part of. And that is a time of 7 years of God's wrath on this earth as he fulfills the discipline of Israel and the saving of Israel. And he also completes his prophetic word to Daniel that there are 70 weeks determined for Daniel, his holy people and holy city. Now, since we mentioned it at the outset that the recall effort here in California has failed, a couple of stories we'll talk about today regarding that. Breitbart reports that the California recall exit poll says the pandemic was the top concern of recall voters. Homelessness came in second. The California recall election exit polls are in, and they show a plurality of citizens in the Golden State consider the pandemic their number one issue. The COVID-19 pandemic remains at the top of voters' minds, with about 1/3 saying it's the biggest issue for the state, according to an exit poll from Medicine Research conducted for CNN. Behind the pandemic, California voters cited homelessness and crime as their second and third concerns. This is followed by just over 1/5 saying homelessness, 1 in 6 saying the economy and wildfires, respectively, and slightly under 1/10 saying crime. And concerns vary across partisan lines. More than 4 in 10 Democrats call coronavirus their top issue, while only 1/5 of Republicans say the same. On the flip side, Republicans are 3 times likely than Democrats to say the economy is their top concern. Now, interesting if you really think about this, the governor of California, and part of the one of the many reasons for these recall efforts is he's destroying our economy. He's putting people out of work. And in essence, putting people, if it weren't for the moratorium on evictions, there'd be a lot more homeless people here in California. So he's costing people jobs. And yet there are many people who are putting that particular issue down the ladder of important reasons to change the people in charge here in California. So and this all plays into actually what I'm going to be talking about this weekend. And again, I'm not sure. I'm sure the church is going to be streaming. But it's the name of the church is Birchman Baptist Church. If you'd like to search for their website and see if they're streaming, I wish I could tell you for sure. I hadn't thought about that before the program started. So, but you can look them up and see if it's streaming live. I'm pretty sure it is. Now, but again, what I'm going to be talking about is the delusion. And we are under a season of delusion. And actually the word that Paul used in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 means fraudulence. As a matter of fact, what he's saying is there'd be an abundance of fraud in the last days. And boy, to use the adage, ain't that the truth? And we see it all around us today. Now, the Jewish News Syndicate is reporting that Iran is a month away from creating a nuclear bomb. The article says 30 days, worst case breakout estimate, Iran could produce a second significant quantity within 3 months after that, according to the Institute for Science and International Security. Iran may be within a month of attaining its first nuclear weapon, according to a report issued by the Institute for Science and International Security on Monday. And according to the report, which was based on data recently published by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, 1 month is the worst case breakout estimate, and the Islamic Republic would be able to produce a significant quantity of weapons-grade uranium within 3 months after that. And the IAEA inspector, nuclear inspector, David Albright, who still heads up the organization, a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution dedicated to informing the public about science and policy, is the one issuing this international security alert, according to its website. The report also notes that the pace at which Iran can enrich uranium has accelerated. The report is based on data from the IAEA's quarterly safeguards report for September 7, 2021, and the UN Nuclear Watchdog Agency's first update on Iran's uranium enrichment program since June of 24. Now, these centrifuges we often hear about, and the separation of the two isotopes within uranium, one fissile, meaning it can be separated, and therefore the U-235 that can be used to make a nuclear device, and the U-238 are separated in this centrifuge process. And we've been hearing stories about them, the advanced centrifuges that they have purchased, kind of the black market type of thing, and accelerated this ability. Now, here's the thing that's important about this story, aside from the fact that here you've got somebody that nobody wants to have the bomb, so to speak, only days away from it. You've now got a new administration in Israel, as you've got a new administration here in the U.S. Two strong voices against Iran, and yet there are overtures being made to maybe get back into the Iran deal when Iran has never slowed down, never backed away from their efforts. And what we have to remember, I think, is just everyday people who maybe aren't nuclear physicists, is that there is no practical use for any energy-related uranium that's enriched beyond 20%. Once you go beyond 20%, you're headed for weapons grade. And they've been doing this all along, and yet you've got people in places of power that have said virtually nothing about the fact that when they reached the 60% U-235 enrichment level, and they were definitely, there's no other reason for them to be enriching uranium other than to weaponize it. And yet here now you've got a leader in Israel who is beyond betrayed his people, much like we see here in our own country with our president leaving behind American citizens in Afghanistan and all the other failures we've been able to watch manifest so quickly within his early presidency. So too, you've got the same problem going on, and we don't have a strong hand like we did under the previous administration, nor does Israel, because the former prime minister of Israel said, without question, Iran will not be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. Now, that feeds into our next story. Arab Sheva, the National News of Israel, says Bennett, Gantz, and Lapid are racing toward a dangerous deal with Iran. Now, dealing with Iran under Netanyahu is different than a deal with Iran under Bennett and Gantz and the Lapid party. Opposition leader and former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu excoriated the Israeli government Wednesday, accusing it of racing toward a dangerous nuclear deal with Tehran. In a Facebook post Wednesday afternoon, Netanyahu and Prime Minister Naftali Bennett had promised the Biden administration not to openly oppose America's return to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal or the establishment of a new arrangement without sufficient alterations. Bennett, Lapid, and Gantz are racing toward a dangerous nuclear deal that will enable Iran to develop a nuclear arsenal, Netanyahu wrote. Bennett promised Biden he wouldn't publicly challenge a return to the nuclear deal, and this is a dangerous mistake. He should have never, Netanyahu said, made such a promise because Iran is an existential threat, and you must fight an existential threat any and every way you can. But now, it is clear why Bennett promised not to oppose a return to the Iran nuclear deal. A large part of his government supports a return to the Iranian nuclear deal, Netanyahu said. So again, as we've talked about in recent weeks, and as we'll continue to talk about the fact that incapable and unstable government leadership around the world is a necessity for the rise to power of the lawless one, the son of perdition, the one who is empowered by Satan himself, through whom there are lying signs and wonders that deceive the whole world into his delusion that he indeed is God. We are at the threshold of these things happening. Now, let me remind you again, it is a biblical prophetic necessity that the church be removed before this time of wrath is poured out upon the whole world. And we are seeing sign after sign, indication after indication that is at the door. Now, the Russia Today says Russia may act if situation on Afghan border deteriorates. And Russian analysts are suggesting Moscow may act if the situation on the Afghan border with former Soviet territories deteriorates. The Kremlin maintains a security pact with its former client states called the Collective Security Treaty Organization. From 2003 to 16, Nikolai Bordyuza, forgive me for that, was Secretary General of the Collective Treaty Organization. And in his capacity, he was involved in curbing the threats from Afghanistan. In an interview with the newspaper, he talked about how the Taliban, which is outlawed in Russia, takeover of Afghanistan poses a threat to Russia, and when the CSTO may potentially get involved, reported the Russian news agency, state news agency, TASS. He noted that the situation in Central Asia is currently changing since a hotspot of instability emerged in the immediate proximity of our allies' borders. It is not clear how the situation will unfold in the wake of the American pullout, but the Taliban does not control the entire country and is facing resistance in Panjshir. In addition to being opposed by rival terrorist groups, a lot will depend on the group's policy, which is now hard to predict. Now, we've seen a lot of promises coming from the Taliban and this newly established government, so to speak. And we have to remember that the Taliban has a track record that we need to be looking at and not listening to their words or promises, because they are already restricting, even though they're making overtures about, yes, we'll allow women in education, but they can't do this, they can't do that, they can't learn this, can't wear this, can't wear that, and all these restrictions that are part of Sharia law that they enforced prior to the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan 20 years ago to keep them at bay. And now here we are, we backed out, and all of a sudden we're trusting the people to do what they said that were the very reason for American loss of lives in Afghanistan in the first place. It's just a delusional world that we're living in. It's hard to believe some of the things that we have to consider and report on in these days. Our next story comes from Turkey, from the Daily Sabah. Taliban want to develop strong relations with Turkey, according to the interim foreign minister. The Taliban are willing to develop strong relations with Turkey, the deputy foreign minister of the group's interim government in Afghanistan said Tuesday. Speaking at his first news conference at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the capital Kabul, Amir Khan Muttaqi said the Taliban also want to establish good relations with other countries. Noting that they are in contact with Turkish authorities, Muttaqi said they expect Turkey to stand by the people of Afghanistan and help with the country's infrastructure work, especially the rebuilding of the Kabul Hamid Karzai International Airport. Referring to a meeting in Geneva on the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, Muttaqi said he appreciated the pledge of more than $1.2 billion in donations to Afghanistan at the conference. I have to pause here and say, what's the matter with people? We know what's the matter with people. The heart is deceitful above all things. What in the world are people doing throwing international community throwing $1.2 billion at a terrorist organization that's already killed people, and the opposition that to their takeover, many have been threatened, run from their homes. People are, as we've talked about in recent days, they're trying to hang on to the outside of an airplane to escape these people and the terrorist rule and regime and all the tyranny that comes with it. And yet the international community is saying, you know what, we want to give you $1.2 billion to help you on your way. It is just unbelievable, the things that we're seeing in these last days. And yet the Bible said that's the way it's going to be. Now, here's an interesting yet tragic story that comes from the American Military News. The headline reads, "How Equipment Left in Afghanistan Will Expose U.S. Secrets." Now, listen to this. This is American Military News. These are military, ex-military professionals writing this. The ultimate winner of 2 decades of war in Afghanistan is likely China. The aircraft and armored vehicles left behind when U.S. forces withdrew will give China, through their eager partners, the Taliban, a broad window into how the U.S. military builds and uses some of its most important tools of war. expect the Chinese military to use this windfall to create and export to client states a new generation of weapons and tactics tailored to U.S. vulnerabilities, said several experts who spent years building, acquiring, and testing some of the equipment that the Taliban now controls. To understand how big a potential loss this is for the U.S., look beyond the headlines for telling a Taliban Air Force. Look instead to the bespoke and relatively primitive pieces of command, control, and communication equipment sitting around in the vehicles the United States left on the tarmacs and airfields. These purpose-built items aren't nearly as invincible to penetration as even your own phone. The only reason we aren't seeing more attacks is because of a veil of secrecy around these systems, said Josh Lospinoso, CEO of cybersecurity company Shift 5. Once you pierce that veil of secrecy, it massively accelerates the timeline for being able to build cyber weapons to attack them. Lospinoso spent 10 years in the Army conducting penetration tests against radios, small computers, and other IT gear commonly deployed in Afghanistan. Take the radios and communications equipment aboard the Afghan Air Force C-130 transport plane captured by the Taliban. The Pentagon has assured that the equipment was disabled, but if any of it remains on the plane, an adversary with time, and you can pick those apart one by one. You now have some or all of the electronic components on that system, and it's a representative laboratory. It's a playground for building, testing, and iterating on cyber attacks where maybe the adversary had a really hard time before until he obtained actual copies of the gear, Lospinoso said. It is a playground for them to develop attacks against similar items. And he was talking about the Humvees left behind. He said it's not just a Humvee. It's not just a vehicle to get you from A to B. It's a Humvee full of radios, technologies, crypto systems, things we don't want our adversaries getting a hold of, said Shea, now chief technologist at the foundation. This is Georgiana Shea, who worked for the Pentagon Research Company. A particular concern, she went on to say, are the electronic countermeasures gear, or ECMs, used to detect improvised explosive devices, IEDs, planted hidden in the ground along the side of the road that have taken American lives for 20 years. Imagine the research and development effort in Afghanistan, that is. Imagine the research and development effort that went into develop those ECM devices that were designed to counter IEDs, said Peter Christensen, a former director of the U.S. Army's National Cyber Range. Now our adversaries have them. They're going to have the software and the hardware that goes to that system, but also develop capabilities to defeat or mitigate the effectiveness of those devices that identify IEDs. This is just a horrid mistake, to say nothing of something we mentioned last week. And I don't think we can get away with it nor get away from it, nor should we. You don't pull the military out first. You pull the military out last. Now, this is either extreme stupidity or it's a calculated effort on the part of the U.S. administration. It's just horrid how this whole thing has been handled. Now, another interesting story, and let me point your minds to the fact that 2 Timothy 3 talks about, and 1 through 5 talks about perilous times coming in the last days, and it includes traitors, the headstrong and the haughty. Now, this is interesting, and this article comes from the Western Journal. The headline reads, Treason. Milley secretly called Chinese general to tell him he'd give China an advance warning of any U.S. attack. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, may have conspired last year to commit treason against then-President Donald Trump and therefore against the United States. That's the takeaway from a new book from Washington Post journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, which recounts that Milley called his Chinese counterpart, General Li Zhongcheng of the People's Liberation Army, on October 3rd, 2020, 4 days before the presidential election took place. According to the Washington Post, Woodward and Costa wrote that during the call, Milley said, General Lee, you and I have known each other for over 5 years now. If we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. It won't be a surprise. According to Woodward and Costa, Lee took the chairman at his word. And if what the Post journalist wrote is true, Milley conspired to commit treason, and he should be removed and prosecuted immediately. It's as simple as that, the article says. Now, American Military News also reports that he held a top secret meeting. General Milley held a top secret meeting to block Trump's nuke access, and he told his staff, disobey all orders except for mine. In the days following the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley held a top secret meeting with senior military officials to take action against then Commander-in-Chief Donald Trump, blocking the president from potentially launching nuclear weapons and ordering staff to ignore all orders except his in a new book entitled Peril. Again, same book by Woodward and Costa. Prior to taking action, Milley had multiple phone calls with China's top general and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, making her complicit in treason as well. The two journalists wrote that Milley was certain that Trump had gone into a serious mental decline in the aftermath of the election, with Trump now all but manic, screaming at officials and constructing his own alternate reality about endless election conspiracies. Milley was reportedly concerned that the president could go rogue. In the secret meeting, Milley ordered the officials in charge of the National Military Command Center not to take orders from anyone except for him. And that is absolutely treason. No matter what you are told, you do the procedure, you do the process. And I'm part of that procedure, Milley ordered, according to the book. The general then moved around the room and received verbal confirmation from each person. Got it? Milley asked, the book said. And the authors wrote that Milley considered the order an oath. Now, I want you to think about this in our military and this man with a high-profile position. Imagine how if his underlings took that position about him. What if somebody that was subservient to him, which he is subservient to the President of the United States, and takes his orders directly from the commander-in-chief of this country, whether he agrees with it or not is irrelevant. And the fact is, he is to obey orders that he receives. What if those under him took that same approach all the way down from this high-ranking general to the private or the seamen in our armies and navies? What if they just decided, well, I think this guy's nuts. I'm not going to obey his orders, and nobody else should too. What a powder keg this man has opened up. And to make no mistake, this is an act of treason. Now, Zero Hedge is interesting. We're going to talk a little bit about the all the pandemic stuff going on and try to wade through some of this crazy information that keeps making its way into the press and reports about this and that and the other thing. Interesting. Here's a kind of a tell-all, if you will. Came out of Israel, reported by Zero Hedge. And the headline says, Hot Mike catches Israeli health minister admitting vaccine passports are about coercion. Unaware that he was on a hot mic and being broadcast live on TV, Israeli Health Minister Nitzan Horowitz admitted that vaccine passports were primarily about coercing skeptical people to get the vaccine. Imposing green pass rules on certain venues is needed only to pressure members of the public to get vaccinated and not for medical reasons, Israeli Health Minister Nitzan Horowitz said on Sunday ahead of the weekly cabinet meeting, reports the Jewish News Syndicate. Unaware that his words were being broadcast live to the nation on Channel 12, Horowitz told Interior Minister Ayelet Shaked that not only should the green pass be removed as a requirement to dine at outdoor restaurants, but also for swimming pools too, not just in restaurants. Epidemiologically, it's true, said Horowitz, adding, the thing is, I'm telling you, our problem is people who don't get vaccinated. We need to influence them a bit. Otherwise, we won't get out of this pandemic situation. The health minister went on to acknowledge that the system wasn't even being enforced in most venues. There's kind of a universality to the Green Pass system other than at malls where I think it should be imposed because now it's clear that it applies nowhere, he said. Now, this is so bizarre. And you know, come on, logically thinking people all over the world, if the vaccine is so effective and everybody needs to have it, then why are people with the vaccine getting sick and dying all over the world? There was just a report that came out yesterday that 80% of people who die of COVID in Scotland were vaccinated fully. Now, if this thing is so great, then why in the world would everybody who has it need to be protected from the people that don't have it? Why would the people who are unvaccinated pose a threat to the vaccinated? It just doesn't make any sense. It's just simple logic. If it's so great and everybody needs it, and it is the means to end the pandemic, then people are left to make their own health decision. And the people who have been vaccinated should be at absolutely zero risk of the unvaccinated. It just doesn't make sense. It tells us it's being exploited. Now, again, let's not be so foolish as to say COVID is a hoax. COVID is real. People are dying. I know some personally who have. I also know some people personally who've had major reactions to the vaccine, including people in the medical community. You have a personal a friend of a family member who is a nurse report that one of her fellow nurses after getting the vaccine has stuttered constantly since. It interrupted something in her speech system. And so she can't even talk like she used to anymore. She stutters constantly. So there are stutters constantly. So there are problems with this. But at the same time, as I said, COVID is the real deal. It is a real sickness, and people are really dying from it. But listen, if you're going to pitch the vaccine, don't say the unvaccinated are putting the vaccinated at risk. The Patriot Daily Press says the NBC Detroit, asked for stories on COVID deaths from among the vaccinated. Listen to this. Gets wrecked with thousands of vaccine injury reports. ABC in Detroit got a lot more than it bargained for, the article says, when it asked its viewers on Facebook this question. Tell us about the deaths of the unvaccinated, the people you know. The Post garnered more than 100,000 responses, nearly all of which talked about family members the readers say were either injured or died from the vaccine. None of the reports can be verified, but the sheer number of responses is anecdotally interesting, as the ratio kids say is epic. Audrey Terrence Ravena wrote, after the vaccines were available, 3 family members did their duty, got vaccinated. One suffered 2 strokes. One suffered neurological problems and tremors. One suffered a pulmonary embolism. All 3 died. She went on to add that she doesn't know anyone who has had COVID except herself, and she has survived. Deanne L. Voth wrote, my friend passed away from COVID, and she was fully vaccinated. Amanda Anderson added, my dad passed away in July after a stroke. I wonder if it was from the vaccine. Jackie Thomas asked, have they reached out to anyone to research those who lost loved ones after or with the vaccinations yet? And no response from ABC. Tammy Marie Watts Staffer said, my friend's father was paralyzed after his first vax. Scott Donaldson wrote, my stepdad's mom passed away very shortly after getting vaccinated. These stories go on and on and on and on about people who have had adverse reactions to the vaccine. And, the CDC, this information is gathered or collected, I should say, on the CDC website. It's called the VAERS page of the website, and it is for the express purpose of tracking adverse reactions to the vaccine. And it's not that they're unaware of it. It's just that, this vaccine has to happen to protect everybody, even though people are getting COVID and dying from COVID who have both doses of the vaccine. I don't know, just something's amiss here, and I think we would all agree with that. Now, talking about corruption and all the other things we're seeing happening around the world politically and from people in places of authority. Breitbart says after the recall election, Newsom could sign a bill to make automatic vote by mail permanent. California Governor Gavin Newsom could sign a bill making California's temporary system of automatically sending vote by mail ballots to every registered voter in the state permanent, whether he is recalled or not. And obviously this was prior to yesterday or 2 days ago. The bill, AB 37, would make the emergency measures adopted in 2020 and later extended in February of 2021 permanent. It's already passed both houses of the California State Legislature and merely awaits Newsom's signature. He could sign it after the recall. Now, Newsom may have held off from signing the bill to avoid the appearance of a power grab as Republicans and independent voters headed to the polls. He also refrained from imposing water restrictions or coronavirus closures before the election. And Democrats generally support automatic voter registration of vote by mail, since the general population is usually more aligned with the Democratic Party than the population of Americans who are likely to turn out to vote on their own. Some Republicans, however, also prefer voting by mail, particularly seniors who tend to be more conservative in their outlook. So, this that went down in California and this particular move, for those of you who live outside of California, those who live outside the country, we have to realize California is the most populous state in the country. We have the most votes, electoral votes of any state in the country. Now, what happens here impacts the rest of the country. And if we're going to make a move with a population of some 40 million people here in California, then that move is going to begin the dominoes to fall in order. Breitbart says, now here's another interesting story. Far left Atlantic admits coronavirus hospitalizations misleading. Roughly half of the reported hospitalizations are not due to infection or severe illness. The far left Atlantic, owned by leftist billionaire and widow of Steve Jobs, Lauren Powell Jobs, admitted in a Monday piece the dramatic reporting on coronavirus hospitalizations may be misleading given it does not account for the severity of the illness of those hospitalized, nor does it specifically identify if individuals are actually hospitalized for another reason. Did you get that? This is someone who is liberal by nature saying that the reported hospitalizations due from COVID-19 don't actually include whether or not people are in the hospital for something else. Federal health officials have been in overdrive as President Joe Biden has pitted the masses against each other, scolding unvaccinated Americans for refusing to get the shot. While the vaccines provide strong protections for the vaccinated, we read about, we hear about, and we see the stories of hospitalized people on their deathbeds among the unvaccinated over these past few weeks, Biden said during his speech last week, deeming it the pandemic of the unvaccinated and warning that his patience is running thin. However, The Atlantic admits the hospitalization number is losing meaning as the number of individuals hospitalized with the virus jumps back to the figures seen earlier this year. While the left-wing outlet identified hospitalizations as a vital metric for tracking the severity and risk of the illness, it noted a recently released study of hospitalization records that puts a different spin on the figures. Ultimately, hospitalization numbers do not indicate the severity of the illness. While some patients require intensive care, that is far from the case for all of them who are hospitalized. In fact, some of the individuals are hospitalized for other reasons entirely, only to discover that they have the coronavirus as well as the reason that they were hospitalized for. Some patients need extensive medical intervention, such as getting intubated. Others require supplemental oxygen or administration of steroids. But there are many COVID patients in the hospital with fairly mild symptoms too, who have been admitted strictly for further observation on account of their comorbidities or because they reported feeling short of breath. Another portion of the patients in this tally are in the hospital for something unrelated to COVID and only discovered that they were infected because they were tested when they were admitted. How many patients fall into each category has been a topic of much speculation. In August, researchers from Harvard Medical School's Tufts Medical Center and the Veterans Affairs healthcare system decided to find out, and researchers have tried to get similar questions before. The outline continued, citing another study published in May by California doctors who tried to identify why children who tested positive for the coronavirus were hospitalized. According to the outlet, researchers found 40 to 45% of children hospitalized were hospitalized for reasons unrelated to COVID-19. So again, we've talked about this, and of course everything gets flagged as misinformation or partially true or by the quote unquote fact checkers of our day. But when it starts coming from the liberal left that there's something wrong with the numbers and somebody's cooking the books, maybe somebody will start paying attention. But who knows in these days of delusion. Now, our next story comes from the Zero Hedge. And it says somehow they still can't understand why nobody trusts the system. And this is where we'll wrap things up in our time today. If you've never heard of Doug the Pug, the article says, you're apparently in the minority. Count me in that group too, the author wrote, because I had to Google him. Unsurprisingly, I found out that Doug the Pug is a dog. He also has a massive social media following with a total audience of 13 million with more than 10 billion views, video views. Most importantly, though, Doug the Pug is a member of an ultra elite group that was exposed by the Wall Street Journal this week. Excuse me. According to the journal's investigation, Facebook grants special privileges to a small percentage, roughly 1/10 of its users, typically celebrities, politicians, athletes, and yes, Doug the Pug. Through a special program that Facebook developed called X-Check or Cross-Check, these super users are above the law. They are free to post whatever content they want, and they're immune from the policy guidelines that constrict average users. And Facebook's algorithms have been increasingly rampaging across the site over the past few years, flagging countless posts as hate speech or misinformation. At a certain point, even the Declaration of Independence and one of Mark Zuckerberg's own videos were flagged for removal. And just recently, Facebook's algorithms removed content posted by the mother of a U.S. Marine who was killed earlier this month in Afghanistan. Her post was justifiably critical of Hunter Biden's dad, and apparently Facebook considered this hate speech. Fortunately, the rules do not apply to Doug the Pug. As irritating as this may be, the article says Facebook is free to enforce or not enforce whatever rules it likes on whomever it likes. That's their right. The issue at hand is Facebook lied about this practice over and over. They told the entire world that they enforce their content policies equally and that no one is above the law. But according to leaked documents that the Journal uncovered, Facebook executives admit we're not actually doing what we say we do publicly. They've lied to their users. They've lied to Congress. They've even lied to their own oversight board. Yet incredibly, these are the people who are able to control the flow of information. They get to decide in their sole discretion what you can see and what you can't, and what you can see and what you can say. They essentially control and define what is true. Now, obviously, we've talked about this many times in the past, the importance when there's a tyrannical government who is seeking to put itself in power, controlling the narrative publicly is of crucial importance. And that's what we're seeing, or why we're seeing these relationships develop between social media companies or big tech and the government. The government even feeding them information about people they've been tracking, so Facebook or social media can restrict their pages or limit those who see it through shadow banning. Excuse me. So again, we live in a crazy world. We live in a world where up is down and down is up, evil is good, good is evil. We live in a time of great delusion. We live in a time where in the Romans 1 moral digression that's presented there that begins with denying God as creator, as most of our country has done. There's a sexual revolution that follows that, including rampant homosexuality that Romans 1 talks about. And God gives people up to their own decisions twice in that passage, and then finally gives them over to do things which are not fitting. And we're seeing that happen all around the world. And we live in a much like Europe long has been, we are now in a season where America could be well described as a post-Christian country. And what a sad reality that is. But we have to keep looking up, because we were told things are going to be a mess when Jesus is coming for the church. The world will be full of violence when Jesus is coming for the church. There'll be lies and all these other things that are being promoted as truth when it's time for Jesus to come for the church. We're going to see weather anomalies. We didn't cover any of those this week, but there have been plenty again this week where strange weather phenomenon are happening around the world, reminding us of Romans 8:22, that the whole of creation groans and travails, waiting for deliverance. And creation fell when man fell, and thorns and thistles were introduced, and all the other shifting of tectonic plates and all of that happened after the flood is now a reality of life on the planet. Listen, things are wrapping up. Yes, it's a tough time to be alive, but it's a great time to be alive. God's still on the throne. People are still getting saved. He's still adding daily to his church those who are being saved. He is still strengthening those who are weak. He is still comforting those who are in sorrow. And listen, all these things going on should disturb us without question, should call us to action without question, but they should keep our eyes on the prize as well. And remember, God told us all these things, so he hasn't. And listen, 2 Timothy 1:7, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. And you know what? Nobody wants to lose a loved one. Obviously, that's a painful, horrific experience. But because we know Christ, we sorrow, yet we don't sorrow in a hopeless state, is what Paul told the church at Thessaloniki. We need to be praying that people are protected from the pandemic. We need to be praying that God make a difference between his people and those who are against him, as he did between the third and fourth plague of the Egyptians, and protected the Israelites through them. And we know that God's going to protect Israel during the tribulation, at least believing Israel during the tribulation as well. So why not ask him to watch over us and to keep us safe in the midst of all this? And I think that's a worthy prayer and a timely reminder for us as we close out our time. And I'll ask you again, please keep us in prayer. Just an awesome weekend last weekend, just an amazing time together talking about our favorite subject, and that is Jesus coming for us and the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, seems to be at hand. And we'll be talking about that again this weekend at the Awaiting His Return conference. Again, if you'd like to watch online, go to the Birchman, Birchman, Baptist Church in Fort Worth, Texas, and check their website and see if they're streaming the event, because I really can't honestly answer yes or no with any certainty. So with that said, I'm Barry Stagner. This has been The Lineup, and we'll see you here, there,